So we've finally made it to the Earth world, which is the fourth and final part of this journey, and it is day 31 in the 40-day journey through the Fairy Realms. And at the end of the last series, I was explaining that I was under the earth and I was walking along that bridge towards where that dwarf key is. And there was a locked door there, and I had this golden scepter, and I touched the scepter to the door and it unlocked, and then I started to descend into the underground caverns, and that's where it left off. And so that's where this journey begins, and I explain I continue on down the deep and dark staircase into the rock corridors below. It feels much like walking through hidden underground chambers of ancient Egypt. And then I explain something in this handwritten version, and it only has one word difference to what I put in the published one, but it makes all the difference. Because in the published one, I basically say, I take a right and I take a left, and then I see a small opening of light far in the distance. And that makes it sound as if you just take a right, take a left, and then it's just right there. But in this one, I have, clarified, I say eventually. So it says, I take a right and then a left until eventually I see a small opening of light far in the distance. So there's obviously, time that this takes to go through this, and I can remember this from the experience itself and from having been there since. The reason that that's important is because when we're tracing out this journey on the map, it helps us to navigate whereabouts we will actually be appearing on this map. And you will remember when we took the fire journey, that place behind where it said the Hesperides is where we met Ushkias, the wizard of the fire world. And when we went into the air realm, we met Ezris, the wizard of the air world, near that house of sorcerers. And when we went into the water realm, we met Semius, the wizard of the water realms, in that top right corner of the map, in that large palace of Murius. And likewise, in this earth realm, we will be meeting the wizard of the earth realm, and his name is Morfessa. And where he actually resides, as far as how it's symbolized, is that little house that's right next to where it says, "Here do they make wishing caps and cloaks of darkness." And I specifically remember that when I go to that particular house, that it's on the right side for me, that house is actually on the right side. Whereas if we were walking from where it says Bogle's Corner and you walked straight up that line, the house would be on the left side. So I knew that I can't have actually, appeared in that realm from this location going forwards, because that would mean that the house would have to be on my left side, and I remember it was on my right side. So that gives me this clue as to where I came out of the underground caves. And I believe I came out where it says the Bolion Caves next to Sapphire Lake, and I'll explain how that is. But basically, when that wizard of the Earthworld, Morfessa, when he said goodbye on the first day, he came up close to my ear and he just said, "In through the outdoor," which is the name of a Led Zeppelin album. Led Zeppelin's actually quite connected to him in general, because the album cover of the Led Zeppelin album, Led Zeppelin 4, which is the one that Stairway to Heaven's on, and you have that album cover with that man that's carrying that burden. That man looks very, very similar to how Morfessa appears to me. He's got a very, there's much about that picture that is very reminiscent of the wizard that I meet there. But basically, I believe that he said that to me to help me to navigate once I would find this map all this time later. And it helped so much to figure out where I was. So basically, I know that I'm over by that key, and I'm going downwards towards where it says Bogle's Corner, but I'm under the earth, like in those caverns. And so when it says I take a right, that would mean that I turn right from, because I'm facing us, like the way that we're looking at the map, I would be facing towards us when I'm walking down there. So if I take a right, that would mean it would be our left. So I take a right, and then I take a left, and then eventually I see a light. So basically, I take this right and I go around, and I'm basically going all the way up to where those Bolion caves are. And that's when I take the left, and then eventually I start to see this light appearing as I'm getting close to the entrance of the Bolion caves. And I actually eventually come out one of those cavern doors. I continue to walk down the long stone hallways towards the light until I can begin to make out distant tall towers and city-like structures with comforting, glistening lights coming from far away. I finally walk out into the open, and it is early night with the stars out and the black sky and a mild temperature. And you can see the stars are all here as well, depicted up in this black sky. And this is, a much more night feel. And there's usually snow on these mountains as well, near the kobolds caves and everything. But where I was in this particular area was much warmer. It was kind of just like this mild temperature. And basically where it says, here do they make wishing caps and cloaks of darkness, you can see that near to that, you can see this little symbol, and that symbol represents a village inn, which represents the fact that there's actually a type of village in this area. And one thing that I can explain is, even though here on this map it looks like this desolate realm where there's just this one house and then just fields, in reality there's actually cities, like a whole street of houses like along this whole thing. But everything about the Earth realm is very concealed, camouflaged, and hidden, and all of that is represented on this map. So I explained that around me I can see some very familiar looking streets and houses, which are quite similar in design to some of the houses we see in the physical plane. And you can see that the house there, and even the one up near the kobolds caves, these are very human-like design houses. Even that house down by the workshop for 7 League Boots, they're much more human in their design than some of the other ones that we've seen along the way. And I mentioned that many of the structures here are reminiscent of the human world in some capacity. There are parks of shorter grass to my left. So that's over where you can see like the donkey cabbages are grown here, the clury corn, and basically these kind of like park areas in grass. And then I say that there's an old road leading down the middle, and that would be represented by that red line that he has drawn through there, and a collection of cozy looking square houses along the right side of the street. And so one of those is actually the house of Morfessa that you can see there, but there is a whole lot of them, and it's almost as if he's represented them just by drawing one. And like I said, that village inn symbol represents an inn that's part of a whole village. And a village would not be made of just one house there. So like I'm saying, there's basically a whole lot of houses there and a street and everything. And I'll go into that as we continue. Many of the paths and buildings appear empty, and yet there is a feeling here of life and awareness, even if it is from the trees or the crystal tower lights or the very feel in the air itself. I begin to receive several flashbacks of other ancient days in which I have spent much time here, even when the leaves were still on the trees that are now barren. The land does not feel entirely desolate. In many ways, it is really quite homely and heartwarming. And one of those memories actually that I have is this building where there's almost like these bunk beds made of wood. And I just remember that there was no door on the house. And it was warm enough that basically, we would go in there and you would sleep a little bit, and then you would come out into the night at any time, and you're under the stars, and, you'd hear people coming and going, and, it was just one of those really free atmospheres. And this particular area of the Earth world is one of the safer parts. The deeper we go into the Earth realm, you'll see that it becomes really one of the darkest locations out of all the fairy realms, but in this particular area it is one of the safer parts. Sometimes you can still see these kind of ruffian people there and things like that, but generally it's relatively safe as long as you keep to yourself. But sometimes there can be wolves roaming around, and there is still danger there and everything, but that particular area is one of the safer parts considering how it can be in the Earth realm. And so basically I'm just walking along that part, and I say, after exploring these main streets and side streets for a while, then I find that I have made myself to the center circle of these paths, where I discover a very large and black stone that is taller than me. Now again, because of how secretive and disguised this particular realm is in the Earth realm, there's a lot that you can see there that is not able to be depicted on this map. And one of the ways that this is depicted is when I'm going underground, I tend to write these sort of dotted lines to represent the fact that I'm under the earth. Whereas when I'm above the earth, then I draw the lines, fully through. And you can see that when I trace out my whole journey on this map, it actually starts to create this shape of this face. almost like a wizard or a dwarf being. And as we continue on, you'll see that becomes more and more elaborate as we go. But the fact that there's all the dotted lines around represents the fact that he's concealed and camouflaged and hidden and invisible. And remember, it does say here do they make wishing caps and cloaks of darkness. So this whole area is very much shrouded in secrecy and camouflage. And this is one of the reasons why, so much that is actually there is not actually depicted visibly on the map, unless you actually go there and experience a lot of these things for yourself. So anyway, there's this huge stone there that I was referring to, and that's basically over where it says, here they make wishing caps and cloaks of darkness. And I say this is known as a meteoric rock, which fell from the stars at the dawn of time. And again, you can see the stars, represented up the top there. Just to be in the presence of this black stone fills my being with deep recollections and ancient knowings of this land. In the distance and towering high, I can also make out large tall towers and buildings with great crystals shining atop them, spreading light out over various parts of the city. And we do have references to crystals here with the sapphire lake, connected with rubies and sapphires. And then you've also got the tower by the Lake of Weeping, which is here. And you can see on the top of it, there's quite an interesting structure that almost looks similar to how you think of a UFO with those lights around and things like that. But that's just an interesting tower structure. And I mentioned there are all kinds of surrounding buildings in the area of a shining, dazzling golden light. I have walked past bridges, rivers, parks, streets and temples along a cobbled pathway to get here. And the fact that I said cobbled is quite interesting in the case that basically over to the left you've got the workshop for 7 league boots, and obviously people who work on shoes and everything are called cobblers. And over to the right you've got the kobolds' caves. So the fact that I mentioned walking along this cobbled street is actually quite relevant to both of these themes. And so I see no people or vehicles still, and there is a general sparkling silence in the air. I am now guided to take the small black stone that I received from the fairy emblem at the end of the Book of Water. And I press this stone into a small missing hollow of the meteoric rock where it fits perfectly. So this is that stone which I showed at the end of the last episode. And it's technically a smoky quartz, though it's very black. It's quite a dark color unless you shine light right on it. And I'll go more into the magical qualities of this stone as we get through more of these days. But basically, I explain here that no sooner have I done this when I feel an ancient wisdom of the land burst into my soul, and I turn to see the wizard of the earth world, which again, this is Morfessa. And I actually do believe that his name is not completely unrelated to the idea of Morpheus, who is like the god of dreams, because Morfessa is also very, very connected to dreams and the dream realm, and he can teach you how to travel in dreams and astral projection and these kinds of things. So he's very much connected to the dream realm. So I think it's quite interesting that his name is Morfessa, and it's so similar to Morpheus, who is the god of dreams. And I write here, he stands before me in full beard, looking at me darkly and curiously. The man is wearing a hat, and he looks quite similar in overall appearance to the man depicted on the front cover of Led Zeppelin 4. So that's what I was saying earlier. He looks very, very similar to that being. So that's a great way to kind of get an idea of what it looked like when I saw him. And when I first saw him, I actually did feel kind of unsettled, and I wasn't quite sure what to make of him, but I soon warmed to him, and he's actually just an absolutely amazing wizard, and I actually probably connect to him maybe the most of all of them, even though my first impression I was kind of like not sure, but I ended up actually getting very, very close to him. And so it mentions here, the wizard has a slightly frightening presence at first, and yet is so very welcoming that it does not take long for me to adjust and warm to him. He takes me on a short route to his abode very nearby, just off the broad cobbled street. So again, you're seeing that you've got the workshop for 7 league boots over there, which is reminiscent of the idea of cobblers and the cobbled street. And then you've got his house right next to where we are. So I mentioned, it's really not far from there. And I specifically remember just from being there that it's over to my right. So I know that I must have come in from where the Bolion caves are shown, and I must have come in that direction and I was, standing somewhat close to there, so that's why I know that that stone has to be somewhere around there, but it's cloaked in darkness. And then I turned to the right, and that's where his house is, not far from there. He told me the same about this stone, that I should always keep it covered when I'm not using it and things like that. So, just thinking of how that stone is even connected to, this great stone that we're talking about here, magically and symbolically, I still feel that that also represents the idea of something being cloaked or shrouded in darkness and mystery. He has to press firmly on the wooden door several times with his shoulder, this is into that little house there, for the door to finally give way and to open with a loud creaking noise. We walk inside and he lights several candles before closing the door again behind us. Inside the structure looks relatively similar to some old houses or cottages we might find in the human world, as it does also on this map, with a simple kitchen near the entrance, leading into a small and cozy living room which has a couch lying along the west wall with a table in front of it for placing particular items or drinks. And you can see that this house is actually kind of also separated into those two areas, and the one at the front is what I'm describing as that kind of kitchen area, and then you go back into a more living room area, which is still quite small, but there is that couch there and there's the table and everything. It still feels quite small there. Here he serves me a kind of tea, and after drinking just a small amount, I can already begin to see new clear energies and life forms. Now this is one of those things again that it's almost like we first enter into a very invisible realm, and then once he gave me this tea, it's like it opened my eyes and I could start to see things that previously were invisible to me. And it's very similar to how he's actually drawn this map, that when you first look at this area, it looks almost desolate, like there's not too much there, there's some animals and things like that, and it just seems like this empty place. But the deeper you go into it and the more that you start to explore, the more it starts to turn into this, hidden city that's there, that's kind of all concealed and camouflaged. It starts out very, very camouflaged. So he serves me that tea, then I can start to see new clear energies and life forms. And then it says here, the wizard begins to explain to me how the gnomes of the earth beyond the distant mountains, as well as other beings, will often come out quite visibly in the human world, but at night and by cover of darkness. So this is him actually telling me that, the gnomes and certain beings of the fairy realms actually do come out in this realm, in this human world, but they come out by cover of darkness and camouflage, so we usually would not see them. Obviously, some of the beings that we've talked about in the previous series are probably of a different density of some sort, but the beings specifically connected with the earth realm, like the gnomes and things, actually can come into the human realm, is what he's saying here. You can see here under the etymology of nightmare that mere is connected with a goblin that causes nightmares, or incubus. It says night goblin, incubus, oppressed sleep. Old English mere can also be witch or sorcerer and things like that, but there's a Proto-Germanic term Maron, meaning goblin. So, this is actually, this whole area does have connections with these goblins and everything in the northernmost part. The wizard then guides me in a vision to a cathedral. Now, keep in mind, at this point, we're still in his house there. And just like I said, his connections with dreams and visions, like with Morpheus, so him being Morfessa, he actually teaches you how to travel in visions and dreams, and he can basically take you out of your body so that you can experience, more of these hidden parts of the land. So after he gave me this drink, he basically took me in vision to a cathedral wherein I find beings whose purpose it is to weave the tears of the world into great blessings for the earth. Now you can see right next to his house is literally the Lake of Weeping. So on that day, I was basically explaining I'm in his house, and he leads me to a cathedral where they weave the tears of the world into blessings. And right next to his house is the Lake of Weeping. And if you follow that lake down, it falls down here to where it says Blackadder Lake. And if you continue on past there, then the water falls down to where it shows the Elfin Monastery. And that was the cathedral-like building that I talked about, where I see these dark hooded beings who were in the Elfin Monastery. And this is actually a place I'm very familiar with. I've gone back there many times since. I've done these various quests and things there, and I've unlocked a lot about that building. But I first saw it in vision on this day, past the Lake of Weeping, which flows down to the Elfin Monastery, which I describe in here as a cathedral. I say there are many black-hooded individuals with their heads down in this cathedral, and I do not further inquire. It's funny that I say black-hooded because this is also black at a lake just above it. Like literally the hood or the crown of this area is black at a lake, and I said that there are many black-hooded individuals. So when you think about it, you know, I'm in this location with that wizard, and I'm talking about, you know, all the weeping and crying of the world, the tears of the world, going down to a cathedral-like place where there's these black-hooded beings, and here we've got the Lake of Weeping, black at a lake, and then an Elfin Monastery Cathedral. So it's clearly this area where I was. Suddenly I find myself back in the small cottage, out of trance, with the wizard close to me and whispering in my ear about how there are unwanted watchers right now, and that we will have to resume on a future occasion. He tells me to cover the black, smoky quartz crystal that I have when it is not being used for scrying or for accessing these worlds. And it's interesting because those dragons that are shown right next to the cathedral would also be considered watchers, because dragons are connected, even in the name of their etymology, with seeing and piercing sight and things like this. Just like I've explained in previous episodes about how dragonflies have like amazing, almost 360-degree vision and so forth. And I actually did share a poem in here by Thomas Hood, again connected with that idea of like the black hooded beings. And Thomas Hood basically has a poem called A Lake and a Fairy Boat, and it talks about sailing away from the dragons that watch us here. So I actually did put that here because when I awoke from this vision, I had a message from a friend of mine who sent me that poem just as soon as I woke from this vision, which I felt was so relevant that I included it there. But now it's even more relevant because there actually are dragons shown there, and he was telling me we can't go there right now, there's watchers there. And now I understand that he was actually referring to the dragons. Whereas I actually thought he was talking about like people in the human world or something like that, but I actually think he was referring to those dragon beings. And then to confirm what I'm explaining, because obviously it doesn't sound automatically convincing when I say, you know, actually when you're there, it's not really like how it looks on the map, and things are round the other way around, and, you know, there's actually a building here when there's not, and it, you know, it sounds strange, but I did write here, he also whispers in my ear that this is the land of disguise and misdirection, the world of camouflage and shadows. And again, this is right outside his house. It says, here do they make wishing caps and cloaks of darkness. So I say that this is the land of disguise and misdirection, the world of camouflage and shadows. That there are also many hidden beings upon the earth right now who are so well disguised that we may frequently pass them by without even the slightest clue that they were right in front of us. And it's interesting because when you draw that whole line that I experienced in vision, again, this would be, you know, the dotted line because I was, you know, in my more astral form, and I go down that Lake of Weeping, you know, through the Blackadder Lake and down to the cathedral, that creates like the whole arm and leg and everything of that dwarf / wizard-like being with the beard and everything. That continues that journey, and you can see that his eyes become those two cave openings by the Boleon caves, and he's got like the nose and the mouth, which is basically, you know, leading towards that house. So when I trace out my whole journey, it literally created this shape of this hidden, disguised being that was technically there all along, but you wouldn't really see him unless you followed that exact path that I took. And so, you know, this only just goes to show how many other paths are, you know, here right now that we just wouldn't know or see if we didn't trace out the stories in the correct way that, you know, may be connected to various fairy tales that are mentioned here, or different things that would then highlight and, you know, bring more and more things to light that are currently hidden or invisible in the darkness. And I say that I ponder upon the distant snow-covered mountains, which, you know, would be over where you've got the cobbled caves. Up on top of that, there's often snow there, also where the cliffs of the giants are and things like that. And I'm pondering how one who is dressed all in white would be well disguised in a land of snow and ice. I also hear reference to the book The Divine Comedy before I wake, particularly in relation to ice and the three faces of the devil, being white, yellow, red, and black. The wizard slips out the door in hood by cover of darkness, speaking the words, in through the outdoor. So again, this was like this clue that was telling me, that everything was basically turned right around. So again, this is a land of misdirection. So if you think that you would be coming in one way, it's actually that you're going in the other way. And the fact that I was talking here about, the faces of the devil and things like that is interesting, because the workshop for 7 league boots, technically 7 league boots are, they would wear these and they'd be able to travel 7 leagues in one step. So basically they could, traverse a lot more ground in a shorter time. And that is very true as a symbol. And there's, connections in these different fairy tales. And if you come across those when you're reading the fairy tales, it means you can, you might be on one part of the map and you could suddenly be in a completely different part and having traveled there really fast. But the other meaning of it is also, you will have heard people say that they were in league with the devil and things like this. And there is often this thing where people make deals with the devil for 7 years, and they have to sort of serve him for 7 years. And basically this idea of the workshop for 7 league boots is not entirely irrelevant to the devil as well. I do believe that there's connections there too, because I've noticed that certain things that were connected with the devil when reading, Grimm's tales and things, have actually sometimes been located in that particular area. So I don't think it was a coincidence that I mentioned that either. And then I said, just as I awoke, a close friend of mine had sent me a poem of great relevance to camouflage and secrecy by Thomas Hood, called A Lake and a Fairy Boat. And that's what I was mentioning before. And it basically says, a lake and a fairy boat to sail in the moonlight clear. And I can't help but think of that sapphire lake over there. And you can see this sort of fairy boat there, because basically he looks completely translucent. You can see this almost invisible see-through being there on a fairy boat on the sapphire lake. So it says, a lake and a fairy boat to sail in the moonlight clear. And merrily we would float from the dragons that watch us here. And I was talking about how you could disguise yourself in light, or in, by also wearing white and things like this, even from watching dragons and things like that. And the poem is very similar to that idea, because it says, thy gown should be snow white silk and strings of orient pearls, being, something that's like very see-through and everything, like gossamers dipped in milk. So all connected with this color of white, because of the fact that they're in this icy land, should twine with thy raven curls. But in this particular area, there's almost that double meaning of the fact that you've got these actual raven-like birds over here by the Lake of Weeping. The word raven or crow is quite connected to this particular land, because crow is corvus, C-O-R, and that word cor comes through a lot when we're talking about some of these particular lands. There's references, for example, to like Corindor or Corindor that I talk about in this book, and it reminds me in a sense of what sapphires or rubies are actually called too, because the other name of a sapphire or a ruby is corundum. And this can refer to, rubies or sapphires, corundum. And in this book, I talk a lot about Corindor, this almost like planet Corindor. I have it in the contents somewhere. Basically, I mentioned this thing called Corindu, C-O-R-I-N-D-U. And that's a very similar word to corundum there. And I basically was connecting it to how in 1961, an American radio amateur named Bob Reno was contacted on his radio by a race of alien beings called Corindians, or inhabitants of the planet Corindor. His story has been published in the book UFO Contact from Corindor. It was one of my favorites to study, actually. It's got just amazing information, and he had like languages and drawings and diagrams and all these things. It was just like so cool. His claims have been investigated by several researchers who have concluded that he is sincere about what happened. This race of alien beings are described as human-looking but shorter than humans, about 4 to 5 feet tall. Renault writes that their bodies are short and solidly constructed, with eyes the same ratio to their heads as ours. They were hairless and bald, which is also how I've described the gnomes in this book, and their ears were pointed. Their heads were rounded. I also had mentioned in this book about the round heads of the gnomes, and I also connected that to the word cob, like kobold, because cob also means rounded, like a cobweb and things like that. Providing larger cranial activity. Gnome is also very connected to knowledge and gnosis and things like that too. The torso is described as powerfully muscular, and gnomes are also surprisingly very strong as well, as are the dwarves. Bob's main contact was with a woman named Lynn Erie, who he eventually got to meet, along with other core Indians. All information regarding this peculiar and mysterious case is available to read about in the TerraCore files, where one can find journal entries of his contact with these beings, as well as core Indian language notes, maps, diagrams, and detailed information regarding these beings. It has been pointed out that the name Lynn Erie is potentially derived from a Gaelic word meaning abundance, again connecting to this idea of treasures and jewels and things like that. And the word Corendor is not unlike Gaelic Cor Endor, Corendor, which is a circle or mound of Endor. And I said, very intriguingly, J.R.R. Tolkien's original capital for the gnomes in Valinor in earliest versions is also called Kor, K-O-R. And I go further into there saying that in Tolkien's earliest languages, the name of the hill of Kor specifically referred to its roundness. I also mentioned H. Rider Haggard in his book She Who Must Be Obeyed, talking about the caves of Kor, and going deep into that as well. So I just found all of these concepts very interesting, because where those crows are, and as I said, the scientific name of crows is corvus, is right next to the Sapphire Lake, and as I mentioned, sapphires and rubies are called corundum, so C-O-R again, and they're basically creating this ring or circlet there, and this was saying, like gossamers dipped in milk should twine with thy raven curls. But as far as explaining what that ferry boat may have been made of, a lake and a ferry boat, obviously we're seeing these crystals nearby, the sapphire, the ruby, these crystals near the caves, and we're seeing that transparent boat there. Well, interestingly, obviously to get there we had to go underground past Bogle's Corner. Now the Bogles, they're kind of hard to describe just right away here, but they're connected to this idea of, similar to the boogeyman, that it's almost like something that's actually not as scary as thought, but it creates so much fear around it. Like people think, oh my god, there's goblins in that area, they're gonna kill you, don't go near them, and then they create all these stories around it. There's actually a great Grimm's tale that explains perfectly what the Bogles are, even though it doesn't mention them as Bogles. If you actually trace it out on the map, you can locate it around this area, but it's basically where these different animals that have been like, cast out from their owners because they got too old or they're missing something or whatever, they end up banding together and they travel along, and then they find this particular house where there's these like robbers and thieves staying in it. And they go in, and eventually they scare them so much because the lights go out, and then they have the claws or the teeth or whatever it is, and so the robbers end up running away, and they're terrified. They think that there's like the most scary monsters and beasts ever there, but really it's a collection of these kind of like old animals that have been cast away and everything. And so that particular area in Fairyland is very connected with this idea of basically, as you can see from the pictures, one of them sort of like a dog, another one looks like some other kind of animal, one of them's got like an umbrella. They're not far from the weird wood, and it's basically like a collection of anything that kind of just doesn't belong anywhere else. There's a lot of Grimm's tales that end with the words like, and none know where they went to this day, and often those beings could be found at Bogle's Corner. So it's a place that is considered quite scary, and many are afraid to go near it, just like with the boogeyman. But similar to like with a scarecrow or something like that, the actual danger is not as extreme as it seems. But if you actually look up Bogle Corner, it leads to a place in Indiana, interestingly enough. And in Lewis Township, Clay County, Indiana, there's Bogle Corner. And Indiana, obviously with the word it brings to mind Indian, apparently it says Indiana's name means land of the Indians, or simply Indian land. And this particular area could very well be connected with that, even in Fairyland. And what I find interesting about all of that is you know, there's this song called Silverbow. You can see on the Rosebank version of the map they have Weeping Pool, which is obviously the equivalent to the Lake of Weeping. And right next to that, to the right of it, you have the Hole of Silver Bowls. Is quite interesting in relation to that idea of Bogle Corner and you know, Indiana and this sort of Indian connection, which, you know, obviously Bogle's Corner is not far from that Lake of Weeping. But on the Rosebank version, you don't see the Bogles, you just see the Weeping Pool, and near to it, the Hole of Silver Bowls. And interestingly, there's this song called Silver Bow in 1910, the Rosebank version of the map being a later version than this, like it came out several years later. And so Silver Bow is actually a song that was written, I think, by Percy Wenrich. I don't know if that's how you pronounce that, but it's funny. Wenrich. And Silver Bow is basically a song connected with Indians. So it says things like, beneath the light of a bright starry night, sang a lonely little Indian maid. No lover's sweet serenade has ever won me. As in a dream it would seem, down a stream gaily paddling his tiny canoe, a chieftain longing to woo sang her this song. So it's this, you know, Indian song, the Silver Bow. I don't know exactly if that's the one he was specifically referring to on the Rosebank version of the map, but it's certainly very interesting when connecting the fact of Bogle's Corner and, you know, the Bogle Corner of Indiana and things like this. And I also find it interesting just because of having recognized that Jim Morrison of The Doors had many songs that were connected to Indians. He mentions them in several of his songs. He has got a song called Indian Summer, but he also, you can hear about it in one of his songs that was released called The Ghost Song, and he talks about these Indians, I think where he found them lying on the street bleeding or something like that. But what's interesting to me is that when I hear the melody of Silver Bow, when you hear how he sings the first line of the song, but just those first lines, beneath the light, really reminds me of the Doors song, The Crystal Ship. Before I sleep. Before you slip. Before you slip. Beneath. I don't know. Before you. I don't know if that's just me, but I'm just hearing a connection there. But it is interesting because that song of The Doors, where he sings in that same kind of way that I feel to that Indian song, is called The Crystal Ship. And again, I don't know if all these connections are just coming through in a strange way for some particular reason, but it would not surprise me if that fairy boat that you can see in the Sapphire Lake is basically like a crystal ship. It's just something I just wanted to add there for some reason. Considering this is the area where it says here they make wishing caps and cloaks of darkness, if you find the Grimm's Tale that specifically talks about wishing caps among, you know, there's probably more than one, but one of the main ones is actually called the Crystal Bull. So you've got that crystal connection again next to the Crystal Lake. And that's basically the story, you know, where he's got this wishing cap in there. And you know that whole thing is connected with these crystal bulls and the yolk and these eggs and the birds and all these kinds of things. So all of those themes can actually be found in that particular area of the map. But going back to that lake and a fairy boat poem, there's actually more of that poem which adds red rubies should deck thy hands. And again, the Sapphire Lake, the word sapphire is actually connected with rubies, and so that's what, you know, made me look up, you know, the name ruby in relation to sapphire, and that's where I found the scientific name, which was like related to corundum and, you know, reminded me of Corindor and everything. And what's interesting again is that I mentioned earlier that on top of the Lake of Weeping, I just can't help but see that as almost like this UFO-like shape. And so I can't help but make a connection between this area and planet Corindor and the things that I was talking about with the Corindians and all of these things. So so yeah, I say here, as already mentioned, this poem was sent to me from a friend upon waking from a trance where I had just been learning all about camouflage, secrecy, and the ways in which fairy beings have to disguise themselves from the eyes of humans, often by cover of darkness and other forms of mystery. Same as misdirection, leading in the wrong way, and all these kinds of things, because this is, again, a very secretive and hidden realm. I also mentioned a lyric from Led Zeppelin's Battle of Evermore that says, "At last the sun is shining, the clouds of blue roll by, with flames from the dragon of darkness, the sunlight blinds his eyes." And again, I was just making connections to the fact, of that poem where it's like they're wearing white in this white land, and, they're trying to disguise themselves and camouflage themselves and these kinds of things, because at times these are considered unwanted watchers, and so they want to create camouflage and disguise and secrecy and misdirection. And so basically that's why when you trace out that whole path that I took, it does produce this being, this bearded being of sorts, this unique being that appears here. And you can see that the dotted lines around him sort of give this impression that he's somewhat invisible and hidden and walking around hidden, but because I unlocked the underground pathways that I took and everything, you can see this traced out. So this is basically just a direct example of how things can be right in front of your eyes and you just miss them or you don't see them. And this is also because, this particular realm, being the Earth realm, is much, much closer and connected to our dimension of Earth, to the green world, to where we are. And so when you look at night and you see a tree and it looks like there's a face in the tree and it looks like it's looking at you, and then suddenly it's not, or it's changed or something, it may be that there is really a fairy there, really one of these types of beings that has traveled there, and you're catching a glimpse of it for this moment. And the other thing is, as I mentioned with Nightmare Point and goblins and everything, the fact that there are these beings like the old hag that sits on people's chests when they're asleep, like how it says night hags do swarm here, and Nightmare Point with the goblins, where there is like a goblin that sits on your chest and all these things. This may very well be this kind of like portal in between point between the fairy worlds and the human worlds. I've actually had experiences with that exact nightmare being. I've got it written in my journal and I'll put it right at the end of this, but I've had actual experiences where I met that being, that exact goblin being, and I believe it to be very, very real. When they made these paintings, I don't know if there's like tons of them or just one, but when they made those paintings, like they were based on very real situations, and these beings actually can come through into this dimension and communicate, and it's not just like a hallucination. These are like things that actually have happened all around the whole world. So this book I'm reading from is The Divine Union, and this is the first out of 4, and it's basically this giant collection of journal notes that I took down in 2014 throughout the entire year. When I was communicating with Anna Kingsford, as I mentioned in the Air series, and several other spirits and just all kinds of beings and fairies. All my early fairy experiences are in here, and I basically, documented anything sort of supernatural that took place. And so on March 18th, 2014, called The Nightmare, I explained my experiences with that goblin-like being that sits on people's chests. And so yeah, this is the cool part about the Earth realm, is we get to have these kind of like ghost stories type things. It's one of those realms where there's just a lot of mystique and mystery that comes through, so it's a fun place just to share these different experiences and things. And that's actually something that they do in the Kobold Caves that we'll get into later. They love to sit around with candles and tell stories into the night and all these things, so I'll go into that more when we're there. But anyway, here I wrote, "I woke into a state of sleep paralysis and was lying there in my bed on my right side, unable to move, but feeling vividly awake. At this moment, I heard some scuffling and rustling noises, followed by the sound of a loud thump, that of something quite heavy falling on the floor from a reasonable height. The first thing that intuitively came to my mind was that it was a gnomish, dwarfish-like figure who had fallen to the floor for whatever reason, and soon enough I could hear this creature mumbling and muttering to itself and walking next to my bed, and the sound seemed to come from a similar height to where my head was, so that I immediately knew he was a very short creature. For some reason, I didn't actually feel too afraid, and I genuinely wanted to communicate with it, but I couldn't open my mouth or speak. I tried to reach my hand out in the hope to see what the creature felt like, but my hand just would not move. This would have usually caused me a great deal of terror, but having experienced this type of paralysis thousands of times over the past decade, I am more used to it now, and I was able to still keep reasonably calm considering the circumstances. But the next part is where I began to feel a little more terror, for now I began to hear the loudest sound I've ever heard during sleep paralysis of horse hooves galloping full speed right next to my bed. I don't think it's a coincidence that a nightmare is also called mirror for horse, because when you actually look at the etymology, they say that it's not actually connected to that mirror is connected to goblins and things, and I do think that's true, but I also do think that it is intentionally connected to horses as well, and there's a reason he rides a horse around. The horse seemed absolutely crazy or insane, and I could picture it with this very strange head kind of flapping all over the place with a look of insanity as it galloped to nowhere over and over again. I heard the horse hooves pounding the floor. As I felt completely awake at this point, the terror can only be imagined, considering how absolutely loud and realistic these sounds were, coupled with the fact that it was combined with the unknown and mysterious gnomish creature. The next strange occurrence is that after a great deal of struggling to break free from the paralysis due to the terror of the sound of these horse hooves, I finally broke free and was able to pry my eyes open, and at that precise moment, in an instant, the sounds ceased altogether. It was literally as though someone had turned a switch, for it went from the loudest and most intensely clear sound of horse hooves to utter silence in one single moment. This made me really consider and wonder about the nature of sleep paralysis and that mid-sleep state in our dreams. What is it that allows us to hear such otherworldly sounds in our dreams or in paralysis, or before we are completely awake, and then closes those sounds immediately off from our hearing the moment we fully wake up? And is it possible to keep this faculty switched on so that we are able still to hear those noises even once we are wide awake? I personally believe the sounds to be from real creatures. I believe that in a parallel dimension there was really a horse and a gnomish creature in my bedroom, and that upon waking I simply became unaware of it. However, it was very likely still in my room, making those same noises even once I woke up, though I was unconscious to that. Quite peculiarly, upon waking I reached for my cell phone to check the time, but of course it was switched off, so it took a few moments to turn on, and once I could finally read the time, I was further intrigued to discover that it was 3:03 a.m. So take a minute or so in relation to the time it took to get the phone and switch it on and wait for it to load, which is very slow, and we were practically right on the 3 a.m. hour again. But give or take a minute, what is it about this 3 a.m. hour that causes us to wake with such strange and unique otherworldly and supernatural experiences? Whatever the case, it is certain that 3 a.m. is a very special hour when it comes to communication between worlds, and this is the time I woke from sleep paralysis with this powerful experience. What particularly intrigued me about this situation later is the remembrance of the well-known 1781 oil painting by Henry Fuseli called The Nightmare. In this painting there is a woman dressed all in white who is lying unconscious in bed, either in a deep sleep or perhaps during an intense sleep paralysis episode, and sitting on her chest is a short, gnomish creature, and in the background there is the face of a horse sticking his head out from behind the red curtains, and the horse has particularly strange and crazy white eyes. When I reviewed this painting again after my experience, it took on a whole new meaning to me which I had never considered before. Now when I looked at the face of the horse, all I could remember was the sound of those crazy horse hooves, almost clumsy-like, and it seems strangely familiar, as if I have experienced something similar before. But now I truly feel as though I actually know that horse. It is familiar to me, and just to look at its face reminds me immediately of the experience I have just undergone. It is as though the horse has a whole personality which you can sense. It's very insane and seems to clomp all over the place in a maddening fashion, and all of this is depicted perfectly in the painting, though I had never noticed this before. Secondly, I had always viewed the gnomish creature in this painting to be verging on demonic, and quite terrifying and evil, but after the experience that I had of it and the lack of fear I felt around him, I am considering that he might be good, or at least not evil. Perhaps mischievous, perhaps not completely trustworthy, perhaps a little eccentric or mysterious, but not strictly evil. In fact, after my experience with this gnomish creature, I can now look at the painting without fear, whereas I used to feel a sense of terror upon looking at this painting. Now when I look at the creature closely in the painting, I feel that it is not as evil as many have made it out to be in their fear. If one looks at the creature through the lens of love, as though it is some interesting gnomish creature from an alternate parallel universe, and begins to wonder what his story might be, or what his name is, or where he comes from, the fear ceases. When he was walking next to me, he seemed rather playful, but also very caught up in his own thoughts and funny ideas. All of this was sensed, of course, as during sleep paralysis it is much easier to just telepathically know or feel things, even if you can't physically see them. I cannot even begin to fathom what on earth this creature is actually trying to achieve, or what he is doing by presumably riding around on his crazy horse to people in their sleep, but he must have a purpose of sorts. And of course, people are going to leap to a fearful explanation of evil because this is what everybody does to the unknown, which is merely a reflection of our own fears and the state of our own psyche. If we hear an unknown sound and we immediately attribute it to something negative and evil, only to discover that it was a rabbit, for example. This seems to say more about ourselves. Just because this creature looks different to a human and has a slight frown, we immediately jump to the conclusion that it must be evil, but what is it doing there? What would this creature achieve by sitting on someone during the night? And why does he ride a horse? After hearing the horse hooves, I put the pieces together and I know that the loud clump sound that I originally heard was the sound of the gnomish creature jumping down from his horse. Because he's so short, it is quite a fall for him to jump off the horse, and this is why it sounded like quite a loud bang before he started walking up to my bed. This also poses an interesting question for those that would leap to the conclusion that this story was merely a regurgitation of my own thoughts, or was inspired by having known of that very art piece for several years. For wouldn't it be amazing that the subconscious would be so ahead of my conscious mind that it would create the clump sound well before I even suspected the presence of a horse in my room? In other words, when I first heard the clumping banging sound of something falling from a height, I had no idea what that sound was, and I even started to think of several possible explanations for it. Later, the sound was explained to me once I learned of the presence of the horse, but then if this were all a figment of my imagination, how could the clumping sound of the creature getting down from his horse be created with no explanations before I even knew of the presence of the horse? I'm not saying it would be impossible for the mind to do that, but I'm saying it's less likely, and it would require some further explanation and research. It also wouldn't explain why there exist so many myths, legends, ancient stories, poetry, and artwork, all on the subject of a goblin creature that visits us in our sleep at night, often of a very similar description, and also often said to be a rider of horses. How interesting that the very word nightmare, which we all use when referring to negative dreams, actually refers to a goblin-like creature who rides on people's chests at night. Obviously, this would not be in use if only one or two people had reported the existence of a goblin-like creature, for then those people would merely be deemed crazy, and certainly a word would never be invented by their stories, but instead, clearly this was common knowledge in older times, and people were aware of the existence of this very same gnomish creature that I have just described. Now we tend to put so many scientific explanations on things that we can't even begin to fathom the possibility that there might be parallel dimensions with parallel beings who have certain goals and missions which they carry out during our sleep state, most of which we remain unaware of altogether. In this case, I am tending to gravitate towards the possibility that this creature, who has so widely been deemed as an evil spirit who rides on people's chests for the sole purpose of bringing them bad dreams, contains a grain of truth, but is still largely described in this way due to people's fear. Based on the very realistic experience I went through this morning, I believe that the existence of this creature is absolutely true, and perhaps there are many of them, and that these myths spoke the truth, though the creature may not be as bad as what people assume, but may, for all we know, have a positive purpose, or at the very least, a humorous one. Although his horse did frighten me because of the intensely loud sound, it was not an actual evil feeling or presence. It was one that created a great deal of curiosity, and most of my fear stemmed from the fact that I was unable to move, for otherwise I might have laughed at the experience due to these two characters being so comical in some sense. The very thought of a gnomish-like or goblin creature who rides around on a crazy horse is almost an entertaining and very intriguing one, though it might be fearful in some aspects. It is also very peculiar and makes me very curious as to its origin and its overall purpose, or just to know what exactly it is trying to achieve. So yeah, that's basically what I wrote there. It's just a really interesting thing to ponder, and hopefully it can actually take away some of the fear around it. I mean, some of it sounds scary, but yeah, it's just, I look at this as part of what I was saying, that there's actually these portal locations between the fairy realms and the human realms where we actually are having these experiences where many, like thousands of people around the world at some point or another have this experience where they are actually seeing a goblin-like being or an old hag or something literally from the fairy worlds. and they're coming through into this world through this kind of portal, and they can actually come through for a moment when we're in those, valleys of sleep. Here are the many valleys of sleep in the north. But yeah, in the next episode, we're actually going to travel into those kobolds' caves, and we can meet some of those goblin beings. And I'm also going to take us over to where it says the island of Neverland, associated with Peter Pan. And I have a lot of really cool experiences to go into with that I've actually journaled outside of these books that I've published. So they're not actually in the elemental books, but I've written these by hand, these experiences that I've had in that particular land. And I will go into and explain some of those in the next episode.